Welcome to the Regeneration Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Ben Mand, who is the CEO at Guayakí. Guayakí is supporting regenerative agriculture with their various yerba mate-based products that are farmed in regenerative organic systems. Yerba mate is a tree of the holly family that is native to the Atlantic forest of South America, and the consumption of yerba mate is related to the unique relationship between indigenous peoples and their forest environments developed over millennia. On this episode, we learn how Ben has satisfied his appetite for impact across a wide array of brands, and he shares more about Guayakí's market-driven regeneration approach, detailing what that means for their farming partners, their business, and their consumers. Tons of fun stuff in this one, folks. Let's dive in. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our friend Ben from Guayakí with us. So welcome, Ben.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
We're doing great. We're stoked to have you. I didn't tell you this when we were doing the pre-prep stuff, but I used to represent Guayakí back in like 2012, 2013 in my broker days.
I forgot about that.
And it was one of the first brands that I felt like that I had the honor of selling that really felt like they were making an impact on the planet in a positive way. So excited to have you on and to share the Guayakí story. But for those who, you're a behemoth of a brand, right? I'm sure everybody's familiar, but for those who are unfamiliar, give us a quick lay of the land. What sort of SKUs do you produce, and where can people find you today?
Well, Kyle, I think you might have to. You're going to participate in doing this session today. This might be one of the first times where I'm being interviewed. I'm like, you know what? I'm either going to have a fact checker right online with us, or you're going to join in telling this story.
Well, let me set the table. I was like a low-level merchandiser in 2012, 2013. I can give you like a real deep dive into like what was happening at Whole Foods and Mother's Market, but that's about it. So that's all we got.
Yeah. All right. So now I even forgot. Okay. So you want to know the products and stuff that we sell. I was like, all right, I've got somebody else who's going to do this with me. Right, Kyle? And then you asked me the question. I wasn't even listening. Right. I was like, hey, so, good. So yeah, excited to be here. And I've been with Guayakí for about 3 months now. And, I'll talk a little bit about just the products we have, and then, we can even talk about the origin story. Kyle will probably help me through some of the fuzzy details as I learn this business. But yeah, we're predominantly sold in North America. So just the US is obviously the lion's share of our business, in Canada as well. We've got about between 40 and 50 SKUs. We do everything from loose, and then our yerba mate in the tea bags, which is probably what you were very familiar with in those very early days, Kyle. And then we have the bottles, so certainly the yerba mate in the bottles. We've got it in the cans as well. And so that would be the bulk of our business, the cans being the lion's share of our business.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I think at the time in 2012, 2013, the cans were just exploding. The glass bottle RTD was ready to go, but the cans were like going crazy. And it was so much fun to sell in like huge end caps and all sorts of stuff. And there's one campaign specifically, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But it was like one of the coolest campaigns I've been a part of in the natural food industry. So I'm excited to tell that story when the time comes.
My guy's setting me up on cliffhangers 3 minutes into the episode. I love it. He's a showman.
We're doing it.
Ben, Kyle doesn't consume caffeine, so I got to come with two favorite products on this episode. And my two favorites are the Blueforia and the Rebel Berry. Those are my go-tos. Yeah. What's your Guayakí drink of choice over there that you got today?
Oh, it's so hard to choose because I consume a lot of different ones. I'm drinking the unsweetened traditional right now, and that is nice. One of my favorites. That's probably a go-to for me. I do really like Enlightenment, so I'm a very big mint fan. And then I actually do drink either the yerba mate in the tea bags or loose. So I'll do that oftentimes in the morning. I'll do loose typically on the weekend, oftentimes when I commute to work, I'll throw a bunch of tea bags in with some hot water, and I'll drink that as I drive to work.
Yeah.
Ben, when you go loose, do you do the full gourd with the metal straw, like super classic, or are you like a different type of consumer?
So I do both. Sometimes I do the French press. I do a nice press, and then I'll do some steamed foamed milk with it. So I do a little mate latte, but I also do the gourd as well. So just depends on kind of the mood I'm in, and if depending, if there are others, and if I want to make mate lattes or something like that. I personally kind of like lattes, so I like steamed milk with it. So I like to consume it that way. And there's somebody in our office, in our Venice office, LA. She makes amazing mate lattes. So anytime she asks me, she's like, "I'm making a mate latte. Do you want?" And I'm like, it could be 9 p.m. at night, and I'm getting ready to go to bed. But I'm like, yeah, give me one of those mate lattes.
Yeah, I would be there as well. That sounds like a great perk to have. Ben, we want to you mentioned you've only been on the job for about 3 months now. We definitely want to hear kind of what brought you over. We're going to talk about some things you've done in the past, but just to level set for people that aren't as familiar with the brand, what is the origin story? What's the background? I mean, rather established and scaled brand at this point, but what's the origin story?
Yeah, so about 28 years ago now, give or take, in San Luis Obispo, the origin story is there are three main founders. So Alex, who is from Argentina, and drank yerba mate out of the gourd, and he met David Carr, and then Chris Mann, and so those guys all were the originals, and they met while they were at university there, and they kind of came into it from different angles. There is a funny story of just David was a waiter or Alex was a waiter at a restaurant, and David was there with I think a girlfriend and some friends, and so that's actually the first time that they met. But they became friends. They ended up being in various different events. Started drinking, Alex introduced them to yerba mate, and they became fast friends. They started selling it loose. And the early years, and Kyle, you would know this, the early years, it was all loose yerba mate. So it was drinking it out of the gourd, and it was brewing lots of yerba mate and sharing it and doing gourd circles. And so early days was on the road, in the van, sharing and selling then in these specialty
shops.
For
those who are unfamiliar with the gourd, sorry to interrupt, but describe the gourd and that whole sort of ceremonial, like almost like community drinking situation, because it's not something here in the States. This is the first time I'd ever seen one. I remember Mateo Sluter, who used to work for Guayakí, gave me one when I first met him. And he's like, "Hey, you're selling our product now. We want you to have this like welcome to the family kind of a thing." And it was very it's like, wow, this is amazing. So tell people about the gourd.
Yeah. So, and when I joined, David and I sat down and, during our first update, and, we shared a gourd together. So it's, this small gourd you put in the loose mate. You kind of shake it on its side so you get it to settle a bit. And then you put the metal straw, the bombilla in, and you then add hot water. So not super scalding, like as hot as possible, right? But you put in hot water, you let it steep for a little bit, and then you drink it, you turn it and share it back and forth. And so you're sharing the straw, sharing the gourd, and you just, as you have this conversation, you're passing it back and forth. And it's about connection, right? There's a lot of tradition, and it's about community and connection, which is something that's very, I think, powerful to the brand. And it's something as I come in, it has me thinking very differently about how we build the brand, how you think about office space, how you think about how we engage and how we do things. It certainly has sparked some ideas on how we really embrace this notion of community and connection, which honestly, in the world we live in, feels very lacking at times. This notion of connection and in real life connection, right? Beyond just the digital sense. but actual human connection and talking and having a conversation and just finding commonalities. Like we live in a world that's more divided than we would choose and would want. So yeah, so it's you pass it back and forth. Certainly post COVID or during COVID, that was a very different thing. We sell a lot more cans and bottles nowadays than we do of the loose, but it is actually starting to really come back for us. I think as COVID has subsided and people are finding their new normal, or maybe going back closer to the way life used to be pre-COVID, we're seeing sales of that increase, and it is just it's a really nice tradition and connection point for people. So
awesome. No, I'm sorry, I totally derailed you, but yeah, back to the origin story.
Back to the origin story. So
all my fault.
No, this is good. So they were selling loose, and in those early days, and interesting, like that there are a number of businesses out there that are pretty seasonal. Like ready to drink beverages typically do better during the summer. You still sell lots of beverages in the winter, but you sell more in the summer. Soup, you sell lots in the winter, a little less in the summer. Mm-hmm. Pie crust, you sell lots during the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, but you sell very little outside of that period. So everything's a little bit seasonal, and certainly with hot beverages. So like, the loose yerba mate or even teas and things, oftentimes the sales are a little less during the summer, strong in the winter. And so one of the things that they realized is like, they really wanted to do, like, is there a way to brew this and actually sell it as a ready to drink? And so that's when they started coming out. They had the glass and then launched the cans, as Kyle has pointed out. And that's when the business really took off, right? Because you now are not dealing with like loose mate that you put into this gourd and shake and have a special straw that has, little holes in the bottom such that the yerba mate does not flow into the straw with hot water. It doesn't fit in a cup holder oftentimes because it's a weird shape. So, it's not exactly meant for, portable consumption. And, we're a very portable, convenience-driven society. And so that's when the business really took off, which is just, kind of an exciting thing, using the yerba mate and now, and having a business that has an element and at its backbone being about connection and that tradition, but then having the very portable options for people to consume and enjoy anywhere, anytime.
Totally makes sense. And Ben, I'm really curious to get just a little bit of your history prior to Guayakí and what it was that was attractive about the brand. Like, why did you decide to make the jump to come over to Guayakí?
Yeah, so I'll just say briefly, I would say I grew up in CPG and learning the basics of how to run the business and all of that while I was at General Mills. And while I was at General Mills, I worked across, established businesses to grow, to doing innovation, customer assignments, all different temperature states. And it was just a really good training ground to not only learn the functional aspects of marketing and brand building, but actually you act as like a general manager there and you run the business. And so learned a ton there. And when I was there, one of my personal missions was, how do I take something that reaches 30, 40, 50% of US consumers a year, and how do I make it better? Right? So how do I take something that has such scale, but make it better? And the real trick on those businesses is you report to Wall Street. So it's quarter by quarter by quarter, right? So it is, you can't, there's not really the opportunity to just, we're going to take a couple of years off and, step back and retrench and then do this or whatever. Like you got to keep it going. Right. So, across the businesses, I did things from, eliminating hydrogenated oils to removing artificial flavors, artificial colors, removing MSG, doing a silent reduction in sodium. So for me, it was much more about like, how do I make great tasting products that people can, consume, that people can afford and consume on a regular basis, but how do I make them incrementally better? And how do I then, for me there, beyond the health and wellness aspect of it, it was how do I streamline supply chains, which has a carbon impact. Now, the good news about that type of work is it also saves money, and companies are all about like, how do you drive lean and efficiency? It just so happens that it also it benefits the environment. So things like when I worked on dry dinners, also known as hamburger helper, tuna helper, chicken helper. How do there's nothing like tuna helper at 8:30 in the morning, by the way, when you have to do, a tasting of all the different permutations. I'm like, all right, tuna helper. I'm like, tuna helper isn't exactly what I want to be eating at 8:30 in the morning, but I've done that before. But like, how do you choose pasta types and work with the R&D to densify the pasta such that it packs tighter, but it still cooks up the same? And when you pack it tighter, that means you can get, because the whole insight was I was cubing out trucks, meaning the truck was not full, maxed from a weight standpoint, but it was as full as it could be. So when you can pack it a little bit tighter, you can get into a smaller case. You can maximize your cases, your cartons in a case, cases on a pallet, pallets on a truck, right? And so then just doing some simple things like that saves millions of dollars annually from a cost standpoint, and also reduces your overall carbon impact. So that was what I did there. But then eventually I wanted to go to, how do I go to small companies and now take all the great stuff I learned in a big company and now take something that's small, inherently great, make it stronger, do whatever I have to do. And now how do you scale that? How do you bring that to millions of people? So I started at Plum Organics, which is, early childhood nutrition. So anything from baby, toddler, kid food, purees, crackers, bars, things like that. There, it was all about like, how do I get fresher, better ingredients? How do I incorporate ancient grains and very highly, nutrient dense ingredients into products that we're selling to little ones, and really teaching like food philosophy, like the whole idea of like eating the rainbow of colors, lots of different textures, lots of different things, and really trying to help parents build healthy eaters for life. From there, going to, and this was right before I came here, to Harmless Harvest. And so at Harmless Harvest, another, organic, purpose-driven company. So this whole notion of constructive capitalism, the idea that it's not just investors that should benefit, it should, that everybody, starting with farmers, everybody you interact with all the way through, should benefit from the work that you're doing. And so while I was there, really about, it was 5.5 years ago now that I made the decision to start transitioning that company to regenerative organic. And that was, that's a long path. And at that time, that company was not profitable and not growing fast enough. And so that's when you're charged with, improving the financial results of a company, to then, in month 2, commit the company to fully transitioning to regenerative organic, which is going to cost millions over many years, is not a decision you take lightly. But, as I spoke to the board, ultimately it fits, you have to make, like, running an impact, a purpose-driven business. You don't make decisions for that drive impact when it's convenient to you. It's about making the right decision in the moment and then finding a way as a company to make it happen. And it just felt that, number one, it was totally germane to us as a business. But the real interesting thing and important point to remember, and this is for anybody who's thinking about how you run a business, is there are real benefits beyond just like, it's not just like I'm trying to just do good by the environment. I absolutely am. And there are lots of other benefits. One is we felt that we could, we have a hard time at Harmless, had a hard time from a sourcing standpoint competing with the Chinese, who would buy, they buy coconuts and create diamond cut coconuts that they sell in other markets. That had different economic realities on like what they could pay for it. So it was really hard from a sourcing standpoint. One of the issues we're having is just loyalty with farmers. And one of our stated goals was to raise farmers' income by at least 10%. Right. So when you start creating a real benefit by working with farmers, a financial benefit, and we're doing positive by the environment. But importantly, from a business standpoint, the way regenerative organic works is what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a more biodiverse ecosystem. And that biodiversity is really important to overall health of that ecosystem, including, and very importantly, the soil. right? So you have the right kind of micronutrients, the right kind of bacteria. And what happens is that the root structure becomes better, moisture retention becomes better. And what is one of the top, things that drives yields with coconuts? It's moisture, right? And so if the root structure is better and you have better moisture content, you get more mLs per coconut, so milliliters per coconut, and you have more coconuts per bunch. So there's also long-term a payoff from the business, right? You drive loyalty with farmers, you get better mLs, better, more coconuts per bunch, so you're increasing the supply. But you're also helping farmers because now you have stronger supply, they get to sell more product, and better, even out your financial security as you move forward. So lots of wins, but also wins for the company. So it makes it an easier case to be made. You just have to be willing to make a long-term decision in that moment.
Yeah.
So
We'll plug in the show notes the episode with Allie from Harmless Harvest, but she echoed everything you just said and in spades if people want to, get all the details. But like we titled the recap of the episode, Why Regenerative is like the right thing to do and good for business, which is so clear that was the way that y'all really attacked it, while you're there. So sorry to cut you off, but just.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, absolutely. And so while I was at Harmless, I definitely, you're in a smaller industry. We all know one another, and you have other brands and products out there that you're really interested in. And I have known about Guayakí for years and had consumed it, admittedly not from the gourd early on. So I drank the cans, was typically the format that I consumed. But I knew about the brand, and to me, it was another one of those very special brands that has this deep-seated purpose. And it started with the founders early on in both cases. And as I'm a business person as well, like I just felt that there was opportunity. I felt that it had not really realized its full potential and felt that there was something that I could offer. And so, I kept my eye on it. And one day, I found out that they were looking for a CEO. It was literally in an afternoon. I found that out, and I was going to reach out the next day, and lo and behold, they reached out to me. And so, I went through that process, and I think it's the only time I've ever said this. I remember I talked to the recruiter, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I think they might actually want to talk to you." And I said, and I normally never say something like this, but I said, they'll definitely want to talk to me. Like this job, this is like tailor-made for me.
Hell yeah.
And this is the opportunity. But when you know it, and it was one I'd been tracking for a while. So, and then the rest was history.
Super appreciate the deep dive for the career path. And what I should say is I'm not trying to take credit for everything that you've done, but like my family grew up crushing Hamburger Helper. Like we were like, 3 to 4 boxes, like per meal, 2 to 3 times a week, man. Like, beef stroganoff in particular and cheesy enchilada, those were like staples in my youth. I kid you not. When I was a broker, we did Plum Organics, and I did a ton of work with Plum Organics, in particular, the launch of the ancient grains with the Greek yogurt, those mixed pouches, which I would consume on a regular basis. That's also when I was doing Guayakí. Then when I was with Dirty Hands Merchandising, we crushed Harmless Harvest. So you and I have been kindred like spirits in the CPG world for quite some time. And it's so ironic that we're meeting here now to talk about all this.
Kyle, I think you're going to have to do this interview with me.
We're doing it together, man.
I've got fact checkers on all levels of my career. Did you do consulting as well prior to working at General Mills Products?
maybe not. I don't know. But long story short, what I got most excited about when you're talking about Guayakí, and it's ironic the way you started talking about it is like, people sit in a circle. It's like this weird leaf that people consume. You're just kind of selling it on the side. Reminds me of something else. But what you said in particular is like your gateway in were the cans, right? That was like your gateway into this particular plant that has this incredible impact. And you want to figure out like how you can make this plant even more prolific, or the brand more prolific than it already is. So I think that's really cool. And I think it's a good way to kind of pivot into like what makes the yerba mate plant specifically so different from a lot of other plants, and tell us a little bit about how like it is grown relative to, I don't know if Guayakí is the only shade grown yerba mate, or there are others who are not shade grown, but like talk to us about the plant specifically, and the sort of impact it can have in an environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yerba mate it's like a tea in the sense that its leaves are caffeinated. But interestingly, it's not part of the tea family. It's actually part of the holly family. So it's a totally different species. And so, when you think of sources of caffeine, there's 6 main sources of caffeine. There's tea, there's coffee, there's cacao, right? Yerba mate is one of them. But not many people are familiar with yerba mate. It's indigenous down to in South America, in the Atlantic forests. So often consumed in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and in Brazil. And so let's talk about the leaf. So we harvest the leaf and a bit of the stem, and it is tumble dried, chopped. We age it. And the benefit of the yerba mate is, one, you get the vitamins, minerals, polyphenols, or which are antioxidants that you commonly associate with like a green tea, right? So you get those benefits from there. You get the about similar caffeine as you do from a cup of coffee, so similar caffeine levels. Many people talk about it being just a smoother, less jittery caffeine than coffee. And then there's a little bit of theobromine in there as well, which the compound you find in chocolate, which gives you that enjoyment, maybe a little bit of a euphoria kind of enjoyment feeling as you drink it, as you consume it. So, really an interesting kind of backbone for a product. So that's where it is. So as far as shade grown versus sun grown, so most yerba mate, in fact, I don't know of any other brand that really exclusively does shade grown like we do. So most yerba mate, in its original way, is very shade grown. It's part of the forest, right? So you have different layers of the canopy in the forest, and there's these yerba mate bushes. In some cases, they can grow taller, such that it feels like a tree, or you can keep it, smaller, like more like a bush. And that is, so we do anything from like a wild harvest, meaning it's just growing wild in the forest, and we harvest once a year. So we have agronomists and others that are just constantly assessing and when they're ready. And then you only harvest a certain amount, that is the appropriate amount, such that then the bush regenerates. So we do anything from wild harvest to everything from there to what we do is, one of the things from a regenerative standpoint is what we're trying to do is protect the forest and expand, kind of reclaim land with additional forest. And so what we're doing is we have, in some cases where there's tree cover, but let's say not as dense as like a dense forest, we're planting additional yerba mate there as well as indigenous and other types of trees that are commonly found in that area. And so what we're doing is we're expanding the forest cover. And as you get further to the edges, then you're having to plant more trees, more yerba mate. And so it becomes a little thinner from a tree cover standpoint, but all have some level of shade. That is converse to what a lot of yerba mate has done. It's straight monoculture. So they've stripped the forest. It's just a field, and they're planting rows of yerba mate, and that's what that's what they harvest. And so it's just different. And what we find is, as I talk to the team and like, what are the differences from a taste, and like, are there any kind of taste differences? And what they find is it's a little more bitter when it's sun grown. It's just a harsher leaf because it's a harsher conditions versus you have a smoother yerba mate experience when it's shade grown. And so just that is, and I still am doing all sorts of like sensory cuttings where you can taste, toasted versus regular versus a more green. There are a lot of different ways you can kind of age and roast your yerba mate in addition to shade grown versus sun grown. So I can report back as we go, Kyle. I'm sure you probably know all these. You probably tasted it years ago and can explain to everybody all those differences.
I can't. Like Anthony said earlier, I don't consume caffeine. Haven't consumed caffeine in decades at this point, which is crazy to say out loud. But it's one of those brands that, like, as soon as I represent it, it's like this. I hate that I can't consume this. It drives me crazy because I love the brand so much. And I really appreciate the story you told, because that kind of harkens back to the campaign I mentioned earlier. I can't remember exactly what year it was. It was either 2012 or 2013. And Guayakí had come up with this program that they wanted to run in different Whole Food stores, where they basically calculated, how much Guayakí they sold from cans, bottles, loose, and so on, and what that equated to in terms of like actual loose leaf produced. And then they equated that to number of acres they were able to purchase to grow the rainforest essentially in South America. And they had custom signage for every single individual store to say, hey, thank you, consumers and Whole Food staff. Because of the purchases made at this store, you saved, maybe it was like 300 acres of rainforest. And I'm totally making that number up. I do not recall what it was, but it was individual impact shown at every single location because of that shade-grown mate. And that has stuck with me forever. It was such a cool campaign to make people feel empowered that not only are they purchasing something that's good for them and clean, but it also has this like really tangible benefit to the planet. And I'd never seen anybody else do something like that prior. So that was super cool and so amazing to be a part of it. And me, a part of it is just like the guy who goes to the store and says, hey, you can hang up this cool sign. I did like a finger's worth of the work here. But it was amazing. It was a great campaign.
Was it the finger that you chopped off last night or the...
Maybe could have been, but yeah, for the listeners, I've got a bandaged finger. I cut the top of this finger off yesterday, slicing some carrots. So we're going, I think I'm sharing more in this episode than I have in any previous episode. There's a lot happening.
You're wild and loose with sharing your fingers.
You got to do what you got to do. You got to get your hands dirty.
No, on a serious note, like individualizing impact is really powerful. So I agree with you. It's a great way. Oftentimes we speak in just more macro terms, but when you can do it at a store basis, like a store that you shop at, knowing that you and the other consumers who've bought the product, that's a very powerful message.
Yeah. Agreed. Ben, this might be too much in the weeds on the agronomy side, but I'm curious, in the agroforestry systems or in the rainforest systems that are being created with yerba mate involved, are other things being grown alongside them commodity crops like cacao, coffee, or are they more like stuff that just lives in that forest and doesn't really have a food or beverage application?
It depends. In some of the communities, yes, they are planting other things. So what's interesting, and I've never encountered this in my life, but it's one of my favorite aspects is, our head of Brazil operations and the factory is a PhD ethnobotanist, and so he's from Brazil, and so when you think about factories and all the technical things that go into running a factory and all the business and stuff like that. To have a PhD ethnobotanist running it is, I think, an amazing thing. And to me, it's a testament to who we are as a company. He's wildly, he has learned all the stuff he needs to learn. He's learning all the stuff from running a factory. But to have somebody who, going long-winded way of getting back to your kind of your question and your answer is, he's also working with agronomists, understands like this is the first kind of tree that kind of grows, and this, has the taller canopy, and then you need this layer and this layer, and here are the other things you plant. And so just, that expertise and knowledge and knowing immediately different things and how, whether something's healthy or not, from a plant's, various plants, to approaches on being successful in the forest and on these farms. So there's a variety of types of cover and trees that they plant. In addition to then, oftentimes these are farming communities, and so they're growing other crops as well. Some of which is in a more traditional kind of garden, and some of which is like intercropped into the forest where they have the yerba mate.
Interesting.
Got it. So it sounds like there's some variety depending on the location here. I'm really curious, this plant, especially the shade grown, feels inherently regenerative, right? when it's shade grown, it implies that there's some other plant nearby that is taller, providing shade, biodiversity, really ticking that box. So and I know you've only been at Guayakí for 3 months, but like, what has the quote regenerative journey been like for Guayakí? Because it feels like one of those like inherently regenerative kind of legacy brands before the term was really around. So how are you all navigating the regenerative landscape today, and what are your plans in the future with that term?
Yeah, so for us, regenerative is more than just the farming and regenerative organic farming. It is the business model. So how do we really um, craft products that people really want, that inherently drive demand for a better and a better way of doing business, not only from a regenerative organic farming standpoint, but how we interact with communities, how we partner with suppliers, how we actually run our entire business is this market driven regeneration. So that is really the focus. I think when we get specific to, I would say I'll break down two components that I think are pretty interesting. One is when we think about it from a regenerative organic farming standpoint. To me, there's inherently, because it's shade grown, you're in this forest ecosystem that is inherently regenerative, and we are one of the original that we've been regenerative, and just only are now, as we go through the certifications, getting credit for being regenerative organic. I think the powerful part to me and to the team is as we keep expanding, right? So preserving these forests, right? There are so much of the area has been deforested for cattle and various different things. And to provide a livelihood that that allows people to live in concert with the forest and actually generate an income through the yerba mate is a powerful thing. And so that, to me, from a protecting and then importantly expanding, how do we start, instead of like creeping one way where you're losing forest, how do we creep the other way and expand forest? And that, to me, as a personal mission and just overall as a company, that's where I get a lot of satisfaction, is like when you start expanding, not only protecting and keeping it from being deforested, but now starting to expand that. I think the second thing that I find really powerful in our model is the commitment and partnership that we have with our local communities. And on one hand, yes, when we buy yerba mate, we pay a 25% premium to whatever the market price is. So we make sure that in each area that we're paying 25% higher. And then separately, we have money that goes into a fund that then gets used with these communities. But what I think is powerful, and especially in today's age, is the long-standing commitments and relationships that we have with these communities. And so, this isn't just switching suppliers for cane sugar or peach puree or whatever it may be. This is working with communities for decades, right? So when I went down to South America, I think what really struck me was we have communities that we've been working with for decades, right? So we have agronomists, we have teams that work with these communities on teaching them some ways to, like, how you harvest the seeds, how you get the seedlings to sprout, and then you grow them for a year, and then you plant the seedlings, and like the whole process and what you do. And what is amazing is I got to see and spend time with a community. Is actually an indigenous community that has been marginalized for decades. And this is a community that we've been working with for a couple decades, right? So for a long time. And the level of impact we have there, where it's not just harvesting mate, the yerba mate, but over time, we've worked with them to build a factory, right? And so just a basic upfront processing. So now you think about it, they're not only selling the yerba mate at a premium, but now they're actually doing some processing of it, which means that employs some people, right? And then they get a tolling fee and profit on top of that for running that. And now we've worked with the World Bank, and the World Bank is investing a few $100,000 to finish off and build out this factory. And so now when you think about it, like somebody's got you've got all the offices, the people kind of running it, you got the engineering, you've got the people working on the line, you've got people harvesting. So now you've created purpose for this community where there's it is beyond just a simple harvest, and now you have a lot more sophistication, types of jobs, types of responsibilities. And to me, that is really rewarding. Like, you've worked long term with this community to build kind of an enterprise that they own, they run, and they benefit from. In addition to, we've put water filtration into their community. Like we've done all the other things that I think you would commonly see, but actually working with a community to kind of build up in infrastructure is pretty powerful. And then on the flip side, met with another Indigenous community that we just started a new relationship with, I think like 3 months ago. So it's a brand new, and they're literally like the week before they had just finished this little greenhouse, and where they'll start with the seedlings and stuff. And there will be zero financial benefit from that relationship for at least 5 years, right? Because you have to, like, by the time you get the actual seedlings and then you plant them, it's going to take another 3 to 4 years for those to start, bearing any kind of crop. So, from the day you start, it's 5 years. And that is so much. If you look at the way the business world runs, it's just so much on short-term results, right? Whether you're backed by investors or you're publicly traded, it's hard as leaders and as businesses to really balance that short and long term. And that is, like, to me, that's one of my favorite things, is turning around businesses, getting more out of them, but really, having a stake in the long term and doing the right things long term, but still managing a short-term successful business. And that, I think too many companies are just kind of like the 1% for, or whatever, they just write a check. And to me, what's powerful is it's the long-term relationships. It's rolling up your sleeves and getting in there with communities, and not just simply writing a check.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that Kyle and I enjoy most about this work, is we have so many examples now of regenerative brands really doing that work, which is usually harder and more complex, but also proving that there is a business benefit to it, right? Especially in the long term. And if we look at historically what's happened, in the past 100, 200, 300 years, it's people have gone into these communities, they've extracted all of the resources out, really not have been in right relationship with them. And what y'all are building and have done for the past 20 years is the exact opposite of that. And we need a ton more of that. And I think the modern food consumer is less aware of a lot of those relationships, because everybody puts the cool global South looking farmer on their marketing poster, even if they aren't in right relationship with that person in those communities. Not to mention just all the implications around, this is an indigenous drink. It was cultivated by these indigenous cultures, and wanting to honor that, and just kind of even the non-businessy part of it. And I love market-driven regeneration. I almost wish y'all didn't beat us to that, because I feel like that should be our tagline, Ben. But maybe we'll license it from you, or we'll borrow it from you. But we will definitely kind of endorse it as really cool. I love that y'all are kind of touting that and have trademarked it, because it's beautiful, and I think exemplifies what Kyle and I and this community that we're building here are trying to show people through these brands, is like market-driven regeneration is very possible and very real and happening right now.
It's funny is, while I was at Harmless Harvest, when we were just solidifying, and this is one of the things that often I think is important when the founders are no longer inside the business, they're on the board, they're advising, they're helping, is one of my jobs is to future-proof these businesses. How do we make sure years down the road, when the team that's working on it are no longer there, and there's a whole different set of people, that they're living the doctrine, that they're absolutely, and so, that comes into, kind of core values as a business, and how you hire, how you compensate, how you reward people. But it's also, just kind of language that you use to talk about what you're about. And funny thing is, we never termed it, market-driven regeneration, but at Harmless, we had written copy that was just about like creating that natural demand for, and we talked about the whole concept. That's what we were about, not realizing that essentially that is, what Guayakí was doing. So interestingly, that is a nice parallel. I'll also jump back to one thing that you said, and I think it's, like in these businesses, there's all sorts of just interesting nuggets and surprises and whatnot. And I think, I'm guilty about this as well in the way I talk about it, because it's just often the easiest way that people associate. But we often talk about farmers and the farming. And one of the things I definitely found at Harmless Harvest, but it's even in some cases true here, is often the person harvesting the crop is not necessarily the farmer as well, right? Sometimes they're separate harvesters. And often what I find is when you're thinking about like who is potentially the most vulnerable and who do you want to make sure that you have the right kind of protections in place, it's really the harvester, right? And but that is like consumers, when you think about like when you articulate things and you talk about things, it's just not necessarily what people really understand. They just think farmer, right? And that's just and then as marketers or as business leaders, you just kind of keep perpetuating because it's easier to kind of get the point across. But you know what I always say for my teams is like, it'd be nice for me to stop saying only farmers and really recognize harvesters. But from a policy standpoint, that was one thing, like especially as we got going at Harmless Harvest, that was probably my biggest concern, was making sure that we were really looking out for the harvester, because they're the ones that are the most vulnerable, and where potentially the most abuses occur is with the harvester. So, from a consumer standpoint, they need to know and believe that you're doing right and that you're taking care of these things. And as leaders, when you start to understand who has power, right? It's just the basics of business, right? Whoever has power is kind of like, can wield that responsibly or irresponsibly. And in that ecosystem, that is where sometimes abuses do occur.
Man, I super appreciate that distinction. And it's like, as you say it, it's something that I have known, but have never heard spoken like that clearly. It was like an inherent truth. So yeah, I think that's very well said and well articulated. And I think, AC and I probably had the same thought, like we got to make sure we do that on every podcast episode moving forward and make that distinction clear, because it's so spot on. You mentioned future proofing the business, and I want to kind of like harken back to what you said, working with a company like General Mills. I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, just large publicly traded companies, but it's so different to me because you have these like what I call them like zombie corporations, right? They're not run by founders anymore. They're like run by the board, and their primary goal is to extract profit. So they're like their future proofing model like doesn't really exist because they report to the shareholders who just want to maximize profits. And what you're building in Guayakí is like the exact opposite. And I'm curious, from your standpoint, having worked internally in those publicly traded organizations, like how do you get them to shift to future proofing in this direction? Like what needs to happen to show them like this is how we really need to be thinking about building our businesses moving forward?
First and foremost, it starts with the financials, right? Like the future of business, and I fundamentally believe this, is people. So throughout decades, right? If you ask people like, do you believe in doing right by the environment and by people and whatever, they always say yes, right? Yes. And then you look at their actions and there's a massive gap, right? There's a small portion of people that do it. But that is starting to change. For the first time, we're starting to see this younger generation is finally like, we're reaching a crisis and I can vote with my wallet. And if I'm going to wait for government, if I'm going to wait for other things like that, it's going to take forever. And so more people are voting with their wallet. And that's what they have to recognize is the future. To be successful, if you're going to be selling products, services, whatever it may be, being a responsible business is going to be the table stake. And it's not quite the table stake yet, but it will be in the future. And so, if they want to drive consumer loyalty and price premiums and, drive sales and make profits and stuff like that, they have to be responsible. And it's not just from the consumer standpoint, it's also from a Wall Street standpoint, investors and whatnot. So, the market forces are painting the picture. I think one of the challenges they have is, I think on some level they recognize that, and they will put stakes in the ground and start moving down that way, but they're still okay and winning enough in the short term where you don't have to, it's not like it doesn't have to be a kind of complete overhaul of their business. So, the more people start voting with their wallet and start making impact part of their decision making, that will usher in much swifter. I mean, they're just very marketplace driven. And the challenge, that it is not easy for them. Like if I need regenerative organic cane sugar, there's like one supplier that we know of, and not in huge quantities. We can get it. Like when General Mills needs regenerative organic cane sugar, I mean, there's not enough supply in the world. Now you can. That saying you would buy starts creating the demand, but it's not as easy as just saying it. Like
Right.
you have to work. It takes years working in these farms with people. So inherently, the bigger you are, it just becomes more difficult. Not impossible. It just takes time. You just have to start doing it. And so, yeah. So that's I think the marketplace will force them and will drive that behavior for them.
I think you're spot on. And, coming from Kettle and Fire, we want to source as many regenerative bones as we can. But to your point, like there are not enough regenerative beef and or chicken bones to make all of our products today. The supply chains simply don't exist. So we're working to try to develop those supply chains and build them out so that maybe eventually we can get there. But we can't flip that switch. Supply's just not there.
That's Kyle, that's a really good point. And that's a tricky part for small and large, right? Like large, they have to hit a certain number of sales and profit, and the dynamics of why people are at a big company and how they operate is very different, right? It's more about like, this is a career and a long-term job and type things. And so I personally believe like most people make decisions not to get fired, right? And so it's hard, hard stuff, is inherently doesn't pay off in the short term, and often, doesn't, put you in good stock, from a longevity standpoint. But thinking about it just even from a small company standpoint, at the end of the day, you have to raise money. You have to somehow balance the business realities of sales, growth, and profit while doing these things. And so, you can't be totally unprofitable and very strong from an impact standpoint, because then you're a nonprofit. And like at some point, investors stop investing, right?
Right.
And then on the flip side, just running a business for sales and profits, like long term, like who wants that? Like that brand is soulless, right? There's nothing to it, and it's not going to win in the long term. So you need both, and it is a delicate balance. And that is, there are lots of decisions that benefit both, which is good, but there's also decisions that you make that are maybe more financial or drive sales and profit. But then there are other decisions you're making that are really far more about impact and purpose. And as leaders, you have to balance it, but it's a delicate balance of trying to build out supply, invest in these things, having the resources that work with them that don't necessarily contribute to sales and profit, right? It's you have to find that delicate balance. For each company is a little bit different.
Totally makes sense. And I'm curious, you mentioned voting with your dollar. So how are you all conveying this like additional value add to your consumers moving forward? It's always been shade grown mate. Now it's regenerative mate. Like how are you changing your language and your marketing attributes and topics and things? I'm totally losing track of my thought process here, and I'll say that out loud. How are you pivoting to tell? How are you pivoting to tell that story? Oh, it didn't feel fun, but that's okay. I know you mentioned regenerative organic certified. Like I know those things are happening. Like, what's the plan moving forward? How are you going to tell this new version of sort of the same story?
Yeah, so there are a few things here. I think one, we benefit from. We have a really great kind of ambassador program where people really learn a lot more about our brand. They tend to talk a lot about our brand, and they share the positive things that we do. And unfortunately, like the things that you do from an impact standpoint tend to be a longer story, right? They're not always easy in a one line tagline or whatever it may be to really convey the depth of things you do. So typically it's a longer format type of communication. So certainly when you have great brand ambassadors and they talk about your brand and stuff like that, that is a great way to share it. And that has been the backbone, and we've benefited a lot from that. And honestly, it's like probably one of the best assets that we have is how we engage with our consumers and how they then share beyond. As we move forward, though, we do need to do a better job. I think one of the things that we haven't done a great job is actually just making sure at quick glance that we get credit for some of the great things we do. So, I mean, if you look at a bottle, you don't see anything that just says fair for life. It doesn't say anything about being regenerative organic. None of those types of things are there and present. And honestly, for the vast majority of people, you need a couple of those quick hit things that make it abundantly obvious that, like, okay, they're probably pretty responsible. Now, there are there are certainly companies, there's a range of responsible even within that ecosystem. Like you can have the labels on the front, but what level of commitment and what level of resources and energy are they putting towards furthering themselves in those areas? That always takes a little bit of a longer format, either conversation, marketing, or investigation. But we need to do a better job of those brilliant basics. And that's not something that we've done. It's different than Harmless Harvest, right? When I joined Harmless Harvest, the marketing campaign was all about the farmers and whatnot. And for them, I was like, okay, well, we're already called Harmless Harvest. And we've got, the organic and Fair for Life on the front. And you don't know what fair for life means, but it's not unfair for life. So you already have something there. For them, it's about like, how do you build a little more lifestyle and embracing the pink and whatnot. So each brand is a little bit different on like what your starting point is. Guayakí, certainly you get that there's something from a heritage, from a craft, from a standpoint, but you don't necessarily fully understand the responsible aspect of it. So I think we have to work just a little bit harder than than when I joined Harmless had to, for them, given that their name is, Harmless. So I would say we need to do some of the brilliant basics better. And then I do believe there are some ways that we can go deeper in the verticals that make sense, right? So there's certainly the PR and media and things like that, but there are some ways that we can now start getting, go deeper and interact with other thought leaders, be this leader in this market-driven regeneration, and then focusing in on the areas that we're really, becoming experts, right? So regenerative organic, Fair for Life, and how we work with indigenous communities. Like there's some real powerful aspects to what we do where we can, both as a brand and a personal mission of just helping others, right? Helping other small businesses that are really trying to drive a positive impact. How do you help make them successful?
We've got a way that we can't talk about on this episode, but we're building that way. So we're excited that that's something you want to try to solve for. Yeah, it looks like you had a question ready to go.
Yeah, you'll be briefed on some developments there rather soon, Ben. That we're excited about. I think one thing that I'd be interested to hear you talk about more is, have y'all gotten into the weeds in terms of what the actual future of that claims architecture looks like? Or like, do you want to have rock on pack eventually? What does that look like? Can you do it for those 40, 50 SKUs? What's possible? What's not? Like, what is the actual hardcore application of regen claims on products look like?
Yeah. So one, I definitely want to get the basics of what we do on pack. So the regenerative organic certifications, Fair for Life, we are certified B Corp. Those things I think are really important. And I think, the other thing is just helping break down, even on package, very few people read the back panel or anything. So I recognize that.
Yeah.
But there are some who do. But can we break down into kind of bite size, like what does regenerative organic farming mean? And just some little icon, short, like 1 sentence, 2 sentence max kind of thing on the very, what is Yerba mate? What is the culture? Where did it come from? And just some basics on that. What does it mean to be fair for life? Market-driven regeneration, just as a philosophy, just some of those bite size, I think is really important just in our basic materials, packaging being one of them. But think about it, when we sample, we have a tent, right? That is great real estate because somebody's standing in line to get us, get a sample, right? They're standing there. You've got somebody who's pretty fixated on your brand, wants to try, like, what can you start to share with them on that tent or signage around that? There's just ways you can start bringing it to life. So if you want to do a more immersive, which means more expensive, but you pick a couple, tent pole events where when you're sampling, maybe you spend a little extra and you bring the forest to life and you bring to life what it really, like how you harvest and what you do in addition to handing, we sell it cans and hands, that type of thing. Like in addition to handing out products, can you use that opportunity for a slightly richer experience where maybe not everybody is engaging, but if you get a quarter of people to engage for more than 5 seconds to like 20 seconds, to 30 seconds. And then you have some people who are there for 5 minutes or 15 minutes. Now they've experienced the brand, they know so much more, and then they talk about it. So there's a range of things that we can do, and it's finding the right touch points and the right ways to help seed the story. And we as a leader, part of why I think it's also important, it's not just so we get credit, it's how do you lead a movement and spur others to do this, right? And so having these icons, having these stories, talking about it, helping founders on an individual basis, or just helping engaging with consumers, that those are ways that you can help lead and feed the movement.
I love that response for a variety of reasons, but in particular, like the leading, a brand like Guayakí, with the power you all have, I think, and how much great work you all have done to kind of hone in your message and lead that charge, is something that not every brand can do, right? You all have the size, scale, distribution, and awareness to really make an impact and tell that regenerative story in a way, in a new category, in a way that can resonate and kind of go cross category eventually, right? So you can sort of be the tip of that spear. So that's really exciting. I think you just did a really good job of answering this question from a marketing perspective. And also, I'm cognizant of the fact that you've only been with Guayakí for 3 months, so you're probably still in an assessment phase. But out of curiosity, like, what is coming for the future of Guayakí? Are there additional product types or categories you want to get into? Is it really doubling down where you've already got distribution? Are there additional markets that you're not in right now, or channels? Talk to us about your future plans.
All of the above, actually. But yes, let me break it down in some basic ways.
Yeah.
One, we have a great product, and so what I first and foremost believe is I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to both bolster our core set of products that we have right now, which in some cases might be just some new flavors, different, some with just with cane sugar, others that are unsweetened. So just having a variety and kind of thinking through the different products and the hierarchies, and then making sure from a package design standpoint that we're clear. It's not always, as an outsider coming in, it's not always obvious to me, like especially from even a couple feet away, like what the different flavors and which ones are sweetened with stevia and which ones are unsweetened and which ones. So there's just some basic cleaning things up for consumers so they understand more easily what these different products are, and they can find the product for them that's right for them. Because as we all know, there are very different consumers out there, and some people like it unsweetened, some people like it low sugar, but they like the sweetness, so using a stevia, and others are just give it to me as just regular sugar. I want something simple like that that's delicious, right? So everybody has kind of a different need, but there's kind of your core things there. There are some things I think about on just how we map our supply chain and how and where we brew our mate. So both that I think has massive carbon, like lowers our carbon impact, but also then creates some opportunities from a product standpoint, from a base standpoint. So that is, some ways I think about our core. From an innovation standpoint, there are a number of different directions that we can go. And, even before coming, there was some ideas I had in my head, and it turns out there are never new ideas, just new marketers that join a team. So we're going to dust off some of those things. Now, there were some technical challenges with some of the things that we wanted to do, but I'm confident now. We're building up the resources in the team. We've made it a big focus. So I revealed kind of some key priorities that I felt were critical for success. And one of them is product, right? Both from a core standpoint and from an innovation standpoint, really upping our game there. And if you want to think about it, it's just like, it's not just the cans and whatnot. How do we think about loose? How do we think about the yerba mate in the tea bags, right? How do we think about building that as a backbone, for consumers? So they start to see it in the same light as they see coffee and tea and other sources of caffeine. So I think there are some things we can do there. Thinking then also about where you find it, not just a convenience store or a grocery store. Thinking about where, is that discovery? And is it brewed hot, at a university, a student going in, instead of buying a can, maybe They want a hot mate, right? And how do you sell and brew that for, those types of food service environments? So there's a number of different things we can do to really penetrate and establish yerba mate as its own thing. And that's a different kind of thing than when I was at Harmless Harvest, right? Harmless Harvest, people kind of understand what coconut water is. For Harmless Harvest, it's about like this fresh, much better tasting, perishable coconut water. So it's a better version then, is that concept, versus creating a whole new category. Those are two very different models, and how you and what growth looks like, and the types of activities you have to take to kind of drive that growth.
Yeah.
Man, as somebody who's trying to make bone broth a category, I very much understand a lot of what you're saying, and it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
There's additional steps. It's not easy. People don't understand, what's the difference between bone broth or stock. Like it's difficult to be able to communicate, to your point earlier, like in a small enough window of time and a concise enough period of letters or sentences to effectively communicate those different differentiating points. So sounds like you got your hands full. And I'm excited for what you do. And what I love about your answer was a lot of it is getting back to basics, making sure that you're clearly differentiating your different product types for those different types of consumers, right? So it sounds like there's some low-hanging fruit and also some exciting stuff down the way, which is, super exciting.
Yeah, I'm amazed at how far it's come and how much opportunity still exists. You think about the overall probably household penetration or awareness of yerba mate. I don't know what it is, Ben. Maybe you can tell us. Maybe you can't. But it's still not coffee or regular tea, right? And so it's like we're in this space, and we see Guayakí as this awesome, successful, scaled brand. But there's still so much opportunity out there. So, first question that I feel like you have a very unique perspective on, Ben. Before we go to the final question that we ask everybody, is you've worked in big CPG and you've worked in some of these high growth emerging brands now. We have this regenerative claims universe where we have kind of this variance of claims, right? We have like practice adoption initiatives, like with big CPG that maybe aren't making it to end product, that are mass balanced into supply chains. We have absolutely 100% certified, single ingredient SKUs that are on the Whole Foods shelf with the certification. And then we have stuff in the in-between. When you sit there as a CEO of a brand and you are also an advocate for the positive work that needs to happen in the space, how do you reconcile the differences of those things and that they're happening at the same time? And where do you think that's going to net out? Where are we going to be in 5, 10, 15 years in this regen claims universe?
Yeah, I personally believe regenerative is organic, right? So to me, it doesn't kind of work if you're using pesticides and things like that. That's not regenerative in my mind. So to me, ultimately, regenerative is about organic, and I think that ultimately is the way we're going. And I do believe, I think on some level, most people believe and understand that all the chemicals and stuff that we use can't be good. How bad they are is debatable, but I think a lot of us realize they're really bad, right? And I think, what has been, Mother Nature always knows best. And I think fundamentally, we're going to get to a point where we're just going to embrace Mother Nature. And that is regenerative, organic, and getting rid of all these artificial and pesticides and things like that. So I think that's ultimately where it's going. I think in the meantime, what I would say, and this is just something that's, I think, important for anybody who's on these types of businesses, is I'm always of the philosophy of just put one foot in front of the other. And I think sometimes we all get discouraged by it doesn't seem like that much, or it's not that when I was at Harmless Harvest and we started converting to 100% RPT plastic, so no more virgin plastic. I mean, the first step we did was 30%. And I had a lot of people say is it even worth it? Right. You know what I mean? It's only 30%. I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's 30%. And we start getting experience with it. Just do it and then get better. And then eventually it gave us enough technical capability working with it. Then, because we're blowing our own bottles, then we got to the point where now we know how to do it with 100%. Had we not done that, it would have taken longer to get to 100%. Is really the point. And so progress is, you hear people say progress over perfection. It's 100% true. know where you're trying to go. Like, where are we trying to get to? That is an important exercise of making sure you know where you're going. But just start doing, and don't apologize, and don't feel bad about if it's not perfect, because it's not going to be perfect. And hell, most everything we do is not perfect, right? So just start making it better. And I think that is just important on an individual basis. And I also think just for companies, I talked earlier about this, like balancing things, right? And there are decisions I make that are purely impact. There are decisions I make that are purely profit. There are decisions I make that are purely to drive sales. But I'm balancing the whole thing and making sure that we're doing enough on each one. Now, you never do anything that is at complete the opposite. You wouldn't do something that runs against your core purpose and what you stand for as a brand. Of course you wouldn't do those things. But there are things, and there are lots of decisions that just balance all of them. But I think sometimes that's, like when I speak to leaders or people who work on teams, they almost kind of feel like every decision has to be like all three, right? And you got to balance them. And what happens is when you try to do that on every single decision, you tend to sub-optimize each of those decisions, and it sub-optimizes the company. I'd rather optimize the company and the overall impact in sales and profit, recognizing that some decisions are really just a profit decision, or some decisions really are an impact decisions. And there are plenty that are like all of them, or part or a little bit of profit and a little bit of impact. But don't let that, like, just because you make a decision that really just drives sales or really drives whatever, it's in balance of everything that you're doing. It's funding what you're trying to do from an impact standpoint. And so I think people, what I would, advice I'd give to people is be good with that, right? Because you have to drive progress, and you need a successful business that's driving impact, and you're going to make all sorts of decisions. Keep stepping back, hold yourself accountable. So, like, on the whole, are we doing enough in the areas? But don't get tied down on each individual decision.
Super cool. I mean, Ben, this has been an awesome episode. Really appreciate it. Tons of good insights. Tough question here that we always wrap up with, but I think you've answered it kind of along the way, which has been fun. But how do we get Regen Brands to have 50% market share by 2050? What do we need to do?
I'm going to answer this a little differently than I have so far. I've talked a lot about what we have to do, how you run a business, how we as the bigger businesses like Guayakí, like a Harmless Harvest or whatever it may be, can lead and mentor and help these other generations of brands. I would throw the challenge out to retailers as one constituent in this, and others. Here's the deal. We talked a little bit throughout this of like how hard it is in just a couple words to get across that we're responsible or we're whatever, because we're all fighting just to make sure what, in my case, what is yerba mate and what does it do for you, right? And if I'm not talking about that, then they don't know to buy us for caffeine. So there's like, each of us brands has this, like, you're trying to just sell the product, and then you want them to know, people to know that you're responsible. Retailers, think about it this way. They make decisions on what gets on shelf. And so often big retailers have big pockets, and they really buy their distribution or block out other responsible brands. They do, and oftentimes they are doing the catman, so they're category captain for these categories. And so they do all the back end work, which is great for the retailers, but it's obviously not purely objective, and it certainly serves their self-interest. And so retailers have to make sure that when they're putting products on shelf, we can all talk about we have to drive change. Well, if you have all these fledgling businesses that are barely making it, trying to do it, and then you've retailers who don't put it on shelf, yes, you have to have a good tasting product if you're talking products, and you have to be reasonably priced, right? It can't be a $20 beverage that tastes like crap, right? So it has to be reasonable. I'm not saying that, but they have to take efforts to put those products on shelf. For retailers who are doing private label and doing knockoffs, like just putting an organic seal on there and just doing an organic knockoff, when consumers don't know the layer below, and yet these brands are doing regenerative organic, they're fair for life, they're setting money, they're making sure everybody gets a livable wage, all those things, and the retail and the retailer brands are not doing that. Well, that makes it really tough on these businesses as well. And then just then also from a merchandising standpoint, they have the power to do end caps, which they sell, they make lots of money on, like, but do one on like responsible business, like, you know, a different way of farming, and then have a whole collection of brands on there, and not just Whole Foods, like Target, all the other brands. Now, Target actually does a pretty good job of those types of things as far as big retailers, but we need them to help. We won't get far if it's just a bunch of small manufacturers trying to do this and trying to break through. What you need is you need them to also sign up and putting it on shelf. And then they can, just the way they frame it and with signage and stuff like that, make sure that everybody knows, like, oh, these are all, you know, Fair for Life, or these are all regenerative organic. And what does that mean? And why is that important? Like, there's, you know, straightforward things that they can do to do that. And they can charge for it, right? Some nominal fee that's not like, you know, like not like what a big company can afford to pay, you know, the hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get your brand on an end cap. We're talking nominal amounts, but like it then they share the burden of this transition.
Ben, we started this organization called the Regen Coalition a couple of years ago, and you basically like that answer is like the exact theory of change that we have, like to a T. So you're very much speaking our language, my language for sure. And we think there's a lot of opportunity there. We think it's also really nuanced and difficult right now, especially with the competing certification landscape, where retailers are having a difficult time trying to figure out, okay, do we just do ROC? Is it ROC plus Regenified? Is it ROC Regenified land to market? What about SCI? What about Demeter? You know, so I think that they're having a really difficult time navigating this landscape because they rely so heavily on third-party certifications to begin with. And as we all know, regeneration is so nuanced and complex. Like if there isn't an organization doing that work for them, I think right now it's just sort of they're throwing their arms there like, this is too hard. And that kind of goes back to like why an organization that does this needs to exist. Long story short, love that answer. I think you're spot on. And I'm excited for where those sort of partnerships and activations are going to be in the next, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, because I really think we're going to get there.
100%. Love it, man.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I've really appreciated it. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate your time, Ben.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.